All right, good morning, everyone. Officially, welcome to Monday. Welcome to Monday. I don't think I have any profound things to say to you right now. Hope everybody had a good weekend. I'll say good morning to Kayla, who's here. Good morning, Kayla. And Jesse, who's here. Good morning, Jesse. And Etel is here. Good morning, Etel. Let's just jump into where we were. So we were talking about how this kind of socially constructed idea of race became sort of popular and common, and how it was used to kind of justify, I guess, the countries of the US and Canada, right? And we said that in the United States, they formed a country based on freedom and equality and the pursuit of happiness and all that kind of stuff, which again was true kind of as long as you were a white person, right? And if you weren't a white person, well, you weren't really going to get any of that, right? And again, how do you kind of justify it? How do you explain a country that's freedom and justice for all while you're still enslaving people? And race was kind of a useful concept, right? The idea that people of different races, people of different colors, were actually inferior, right? They were less than the white people, right? They were less developed or less civilized or less intelligent or less kind of just whatever adjective you want to use there. These people were considered as less, right? And again, if once people are kind of dehumanized, once you make them a little bit less than human, it becomes much easier to mistreat them, right? And that's exactly what was going on, right? That these ideas were being spread that, these people weren't really people, right? They were somehow something different and something less, right? And so again, the Americans turned to science, and science went looking for proof of these human races. But for the most part, a lot of this science is not great, right? Because a lot of these researchers had ideas that they were trying to prove, right? For instance, they already thought there was human races. They just had to figure out how to describe it, right? Or they already thought that non-white people were inferior, right, or less than, and so they were just looking for evidence that supported it. And again, it's not really how science works, right? You're supposed to look at the data and then build your theories from there. You're not supposed to build a theory and then try to find a way to prove it, right? That's not how science works. And again, we haven't really talked about this, but human brains are very good at confirming things that they already know, right? It's called confirmation bias. And so your brain sort of is attracted to things that support what you already know or what you already believe, and things that are different, like things that contradict your original beliefs, your brain tends to ignore, right? So our brains are already wired for this anyway. And so, good critical thinkers and good scientists have to be careful of, trying to prove their own theories, because their brain will kind of make them want to, right? So, but again, this was pretty early, in the history of science, and these guys were doing some pretty junk science right here. And so, again, we had Blumenbach doing measuring the skulls, and we had phrenology, and we had all this kind of things that were trying to describe human races. And of course, we know that that's bunk. There are no human biological races at all. But despite that fact, people started to believe that it was real, right? People started to believe that human races were an actual biological fact. And so as a result, it started to find its way into the legal system and into people's kind of culture and socialization. And again, this idea was treated as if it was real. And when humans treat something as if it's real, it basically becomes that way, right? It becomes real. And so race kind of became real as people continued to put more and more kind of emphasis and belief into it, right? And so here you can see that, yeah, that the interest in defining races kind of increases as the United States goes on, right? And again, today we don't have to go too far to see that it's still a problem, right? This founding a nation on race is a problematic thing, right? Because we know things about stereotypes and prejudice that we know that they're sticky, right? They don't go away very easily. And when you write these things into the legal code, then it becomes very difficult to kind of get rid of, because the operation of the country is, proceeding on a racially discriminatory basis, right? And people don't often see it because they feel that this is just normal, right? Because they believe in all these racial ideas as well. And again, maybe we should say, just like, when we were talking about women's suffrage, and we were saying that all of those social institutions were kind of pushing back against women who were fighting for the right to vote, the same thing would happen here, right? All social institutions were involved in maintaining power for white Americans and making sure that black Americans didn't have any, right? And so the medical system, the school system, the criminal justice system, the government, the media, religion, all of those things endorsed or supported a division between black Americans and white Americans. And the fact that black Americans just were somehow not as good, right, as white Americans. And again, it becomes very difficult to make a change, right? Because everywhere you look, this kind of inequality is reinforced or supported, right? You go to church on Sunday, you hear about it, right? You go to school, well, you go to an only white school or an only black school because schools were separated at the time, right? You hear your parents talk about it over dinner, you hear it in the news, you hear people talking about things on the street, and basically everywhere you look, that idea that some people are just not as good as others is reinforced, right? And it becomes very difficult to not believe it, right? It becomes very difficult not to see it as true. I won't show it to you, but in an earlier version of this class, I had a video, and it was from, I think it was from the 1950s, and it was a little kind of documentary on a white neighborhood. So I think it was called Levittown, Pennsylvania. So it was a nice suburban neighborhood. It had just been built. It was very cute, right? Little streets and little white picket fences and cute houses and the whole thing. Very cute. And so everybody had moved into it, but it was an entirely white neighborhood. So there was all white people living there. And then a black family moved in. And the interviewers were kind of going around talking to people, like, what did you think about this now that there's a black family living in your neighborhood? And some people were not sure. Some people were like, well, I think it's fine. I don't have a problem. Other people very clearly expressed their prejudice, right? Like there's one woman who said things like, well, if they want to live in a neighborhood like this, they can't just barge in. Like they have to earn it somehow. And it's like, how do you earn your way into a neighborhood? Like if you can afford a house there, that's it, right? That's all, right? But she kind of felt like somehow they didn't belong there, and she was worried about trouble, right? She's worried that there was going to be trouble with this black family there. It was a black family, and they had two young kids, I think a boy and a girl or something. And she was worried that property values might go down if more black families moved in, and if that happened, then there might be mixing. People might mix, and we don't want that, right? We don't want black and white mixing, right? And so, but again, this is stuff that nobody would dare say today. But she she said it, right? Because she believed it all to be true, right? She believed that, there was a clear difference between white and black Americans, and they should be separated, right? So again, this is kind of, these ideas are hard to get rid of once they're in, right? But unfortunately, even though race was important in kind of the founding of the United States, I'm kind of sorry to tell you that it was also a part of the creation of Canada, right? People up here, I think, in Canada were no less racist than people in the U.S. Fortunately, our early economy didn't, rely on slaves, right, which the U.S. did, but we kind of have our own issues up here, and that's what we started talking about on Friday, right? So we were talking, of course, about. I'll just back up. We were talking, of course, about the relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous Canadians. And again, that's a relationship that goes back, probably at least 300 years, if not more. And again, it kind of starts off very innocently, right? But things change really quick, right? And so within 300 years, these people's way of life has totally changed, and a lot has happened. And so I've been trying to catch you up on some of the important points, right? So on Friday, I said that, we call these people First Nations or First People because they literally are the first people to come to North or South America, right? So I explained that prior to about 14,000 years ago or so, there was a massive ice sheet over all of Canada, and so you couldn't really get into North America in any way, right? Nobody had boats that could sail across an ocean yet, and so people evolved in Africa. They left Africa and they sort of settled in other parts of Asia and Europe, but they couldn't really get into North America until that ice started to melt, right? And when it did, there was a period where you could walk across from, good morning, where you could walk across from eastern Siberia there to Alaska, and people did, and those people are the ancestors of really all Indigenous people in North America, right? So they literally were the first people here. I pointed out to you, of course, that we kind of talk about First Nations people as one group, but they're in fact not. There's a lot of different tribes and languages and cultures and religions and ways of living and ways of kind of, clothing yourself and building shelters and all of that, kind of depending on where these people live, because Canada's got a lot of geographic diversity, right? We have open plains, we have forests, we have places that are a little warmer, like here. We have places that are very cold, like up in the north. And so we've got a lot of different environments, and people figured out different ways to live. So Indigenous people are not really one group. They're many, many, many groups with, some similarities, but also some differences as well. Okay. So I took you back in the story before Canada was Canada, right? I took you all the way back here when Canada was first made a country in 1867, and even a little bit earlier than that, right? When Canada was really just kind of, I guess it was a colony area with French colonies and British colonies, but most of Canada was still populated by Indigenous people, right? And I said that really what people were, the first kind of colonists to come here were, looking for a better life, but there was also some explorers who were interested in exploring and seeing what was here. But there was also a number of traders who were trading with Indigenous people for furs, right? So those fancy top hats that you see, in the 1800s, those are all made of rabbit and beaver fur. And so having hunted all of the beavers in Britain, they needed a new source, and so they were trading with Indigenous people who would hunt the beavers and then give them the furs. So the relationship started out kind of on a very equal basis. I also pointed out here that, again, we're not really sure how many indigenous people were around at the time. There's no official numbers, but just look at the diversity, right? There could have been as many as 450 different languages spoken in Canada. So unreal, right? So again, indigenous people are not one group, they're a collection of different people with distinct cultures and languages and traditions. Again, there are similarities between them, but there's also a lot of differences, right? So they do not. Well, like, you mean today?
No, I mean, yeah.
Well, today basically all indigenous people speak English. Many of their original languages have been forgotten and lost.
Yeah, one of my friends, she doesn't speak, she's First Nation, but she doesn't know how to speak English. But she's like, it's so complicated, it's so hard to learn.
Well, yeah, it is, and it's and so few people actually speak these languages today. I think the people who originally lived on the North Shore, so where North Vancouver and West Vancouver is, the indigenous people who traditionally lived there, the language that they spoke, I think there's only about 4 or 5 people who still speak it. And so those 4 or 5 people are working hard to get everything written down so that and to teach it to younger people, because it's on the verge of extinction, basically. And lots of indigenous languages have already been lost, and yeah, lots of people don't speak them anymore, for reasons that we'll get to very shortly. But yeah, this was a very diverse area with lots of different languages and cultures and beliefs, right? So very quickly we said that people start to arrive maybe around 1600 or so, first missionaries and then explorers and then traders. And again, this is a pretty equal business relationship, right? Europeans are coming over with blankets and axe heads and matches, and maybe a little bit later guns and ammunition that indigenous people want, and indigenous people will trade furs, right? And so and also the Europeans are kind of depending on indigenous people at this point because they don't really know where they are, right? They don't really know how to survive in this land, and indigenous people are kind of helping them out a little bit, right? Teaching them how to live here and how to survive. But like we mentioned, things are going to go downhill reasonably quickly, right? So we said that when Europeans start to come over, they bring a lot of diseases with them. And again, these are diseases that have that originally appeared in Europe. Lots of people have had them already. Lots of people have died. There's no vaccines at this point, so this is basically that herd immunity thing, right? So all the people who were very susceptible to those diseases, they all died hundreds of years ago. And so the people who are still around and still alive have some immunity to those diseases, meaning that they probably won't die if they get them, maybe, right? But for indigenous people, it's just like the coronavirus for us, right? It's brand new for them. Their bodies have never seen it before. Nobody has any antibodies against it, and so these kind of diseases just rip through indigenous populations. They don't know what it is. They've never seen it before. They have no immunity to it at all. And so again, huge numbers of indigenous people die over the next couple hundred years. And we said that it was kind of doubly traumatic because, yes, a lot of these people are dying, which is awful, but also that indigenous people, for the most part, never wrote anything down. So their languages, for instance, but also all of their stories, their myths, their religious beliefs, their skills, right? How to do things. None of that stuff is written down, right? None of it is backed up in any way. And so when huge numbers of their community die, they actually lose a lot of cultural knowledge because they just pass it down by telling stories, right, from one generation to the next. And so if you lose, 40 or 50% of your community, especially the elders, right, because they're most likely to get sick and to die, you lose a lot of that history, right, and culture and knowledge. And so it's kind of doubly traumatic for them because they not only lose people, but they lose chunks of their culture along the way. I pointed this out very quickly. This is this idea of the Royal Proclamation. It was issued by the King of England in 1763. It told the colonists that they couldn't buy land from the indigenous people. They had to buy it from the British government. And the British government would handle the process of buying the land from the indigenous people. But again, indigenous people say that, well, this actually proves that you thought it was our land to begin with because you were going to somehow acquire it from us, right? You were going to somehow buy it from us. And so if that was true, that means that you believe that the land was originally ours, right? So I just thought I'd point that out. Right. So we have diseases. We have a massive population decline. It's catastrophic for indigenous people. But unfortunately, it's not really the end of their troubles at this point. I said that, when Canada was formed, let me see if I can go back to my map. Where's my map? Not that one. That's the one. So, when Canada was formed, when it was brand new, again, the sort of founding fathers of Canada had an idea that Canada would be a country that stretched from sea to shining sea. I think that was the tagline, right? But again, that was quite a bold goal, right? Because there's a lot of land between Ontario and Quebec and the Pacific Ocean, right? British Columbia wasn't a province yet, right? It was still a colony of the UK. Canada would have to kind of entice British Columbia to join their country, which they managed to do. But still, they had to fill all of that land in the middle, right? And again, there weren't many Europeans there. It was mostly indigenous people. But our founding fathers were also worried about the United States because the Americans were kind of pushing toward the west at this point too, and the Canadian government was worried that some of them might come up north and start settling in Rupert's Land. And then if you had Americans settling in there, then it was going to be very difficult to get rid of them, right? Because the Americans were going to take over whatever they could get their hands on, right? So it was kind of a race to see who could, if they could fill in that center section of Canada with Europeans, basically just to kind of keep the Americans out, right? And so the Canadian government went on a bit of a recruitment drive, trying to get as many European farmers as they could to come to Canada. And so they went to Europe, they had posters, they attended fairs, they said, come to Canada where there's lots of land and it's very cheap and you can have your own farm and it'll be wonderful, right? Because a lot of people in Europe, just couldn't afford their own farm at this point in history. There was no land left, really. And so for lots of people, it was a very enticing offer, right? Come to this, wide open, empty land, build your farm, it'll be really cheap, and then you can prosper, right? You can own your own land and own your own farm. The dream for lots of Europeans. But of course, that middle part of Canada wasn't empty, right? There wasn't no one there. There were lots of indigenous people there who had lived there for thousands of years, right? And so the question was, how were they going to be removed, right? How were they going to be pushed aside to make room for these European farmers, right? And again, one of the most effective things that the Canadian government did was to start shooting these guys, right? Because, as I mentioned, these bison are kind of native to that central part of Canada. There used to be millions and millions of these things, like herds of them just moving over the landscape. Again, apparently it looked like a brown carpet. There was so many of them. But of course, the indigenous people were supporting themselves off this animal. But also, you can't set up a bunch of farms and then have these guys trample all over it, right? So the government went about paying a bounty for every bison shot. Every bison shot, you got $2 or something, which at the time was probably a lot of money. And yeah, and European settlers and trappers and all sorts of people went out and just started shooting them, right, and collecting the cash for them. And again, they were very effective at doing this. And so they shot millions and millions and millions of these animals until basically there were none left. And currently in central Canada, there kind of are none left.
How they kill them? What did they do? They sell them or eat them?
Did they what?
What did they do with the animals?
Just left them there.
Just
Yeah, they didn't want to eat them or anything. They were doing it for the money, right? The government was giving you money for everyone you shot.
oh,
So people just went out and shot them, and that was it. But of course, indigenous people were relying on this animal for their survival, right? So the indigenous people hunted the buffalo or the bison here, but of course they used every part of it to live, right? They ate every part of this animal that is edible. They used its skins for clothing and for shelter. They used its bones and horns for tools. Every part of this animal would have been used by indigenous people. And again, they kind of only killed what they needed to survive. But again, Europeans just killed them all for money. And so again, the bison were basically almost exterminated from central Canada, which again made room for all of these European farmers, but it also created a situation where indigenous people couldn't really live anymore, right? Because the thing they had been depending on for their food was now gone, right? And so for a while they did their best to sort of hunt other things, right? To sort of find other foods, which they were able to do. But by the time we get into the sort of middle to late 1800s, it's not looking very good for indigenous people, right? So their original foods are disappearing, more Europeans are showing up, more farms, more towns, railways, roads, all kinds of things. And so the landscape of Canada is really being transformed, right? From just wilderness, right? Just total wilderness to, it's on its way to what you see today, right? It's on its way to being a modern country. And so indigenous people kind of see this, right? They know that their world is changing. They know that the Europeans aren't going home ever, right? And so they kind of realize that, they have to make a deal, right? And they have to figure out how to survive in this kind of new world, right? This new country that is emerging here. And again, that brings us to treaties. And so this mostly applies to indigenous people in the central part of Canada. There are some treaties signed in eastern Canada, not so many here in western Canada. It kind of depends where you were and what the circumstances were in terms of signing them. But a treaty is kind of an agreement, okay? It's a deal. It's a handshake, right? And again, Indigenous people were looking to make a deal with the federal government in order to formally define who owed what to whom, right? So these Europeans were here, right? They were living and working and making a living in the traditional lands of Indigenous people. What were they going to give to Indigenous people for that, right? How were they going to compensate Indigenous people for using their land? Right? And similarly, what were Indigenous people going to let them do, right? What was the kind of boundary of that relationship, right? So they wanted to kind of work that out, okay? And so, yeah, this is what Indigenous people were trying to do, okay? First of all, they were trying to secure the survival of their people, right? Their way of life had changed completely, right? They weren't able to hunt and fish and gather foods the way that they traditionally had. And so they needed to be able to survive in a new world, right? Again, they wanted to establish some sort of relationship with the Canadian government, right? They'd kind of just been existing side by side, but again, you can only do that for so long before you have to figure out what the rules are, right? What is the nature of this relationship? Who is allowed to do what, right? What's permitted, right? So they wanted to do that as well, right? And really what they were thinking is something like this. So this is a very popular kind of artifact from Indigenous Canada. It's called the Wampum Belt. And so wampum, they're kind of like they're beads. And so they've woven all these beads together in kind of a belt, right, that you could tie around yourself.
That's a belt?
It is a belt, but it's kind of a ceremonial one, right? So it's not really one that you would wear every day. It's kind of it's symbolic, right? But what do you think it's symbolic of? What does that look like to you? What's that? Okay. Probably not what they're thinking of, but yeah, I see the similarity there. I see the similarity. But what do you think they were kind of symbolizing here? Think of the natural environment.
The what?
Think of the natural environment. Think of nature. What's often blue in nature?
Water?
Yeah.
Sky?
Yeah.
Like peace and something?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, here we have water. We have two waterways, right? We have two rivers running beside each other, right? And Indigenous people were kind of saying, well, this will be our relationship, right? So we'll paddle our canoe. You know what a canoe is, right? It's like a boat. We'll paddle our canoe down our river. You paddle your canoe down your river. We're going in the same direction. We're kind of side by side, but we're not kind of interfering with each other, right? You guys do your thing over there. We'll do our thing over here. And, we'll just kind of be going in the same direction, but sort of independently. Okay? That's kind of what Indigenous people were thinking, right? They were trying to create a relationship of equals, right? And also a relationship that would continue to evolve, right? So for Indigenous people, the treaty was just kind of the start of the relationship, right? And it would continue to be negotiated and sort of evolve throughout the years, right? It was an ongoing relationship is what they were thinking of. But the Canadian government, as you can see, had different ideas, right? Their goals were entirely different. And so really what they were trying to do is they were trying to buy the land, right? They wanted to buy the land so that they could set up more farms, so that they could get fishing rights, so they could start mining and doing all kinds of things. So they officially wanted to buy the land. Okay. They wanted to encourage the rapid settlement of the West, right? I said they wanted to get a lot of farmers into that central part of Canada to keep the Americans out, right? So that they could build their country from sea to shining sea. Yeah, they wanted to keep the Americans out. And again, they did want to respond to the First Nations' request for treaty, right? Indigenous people were saying, hey, we need to sit down at the table. We need to talk this out, right? We need to come to an agreement. And so they did. But so the treaties are all kind of with each individual group of Indigenous people, and what they're kind of supposed to provide is this. So the treaties are supposed to provide reserve lands for Indigenous people, so land that they could continue to hunt and fish and kind of live their traditional lifestyle on. They were supposed to provide farm animals and farm equipment because Indigenous people knew they would have to start farming. Annual payments, right? They would send them some money every year. Education for their children, right? So Indigenous people knew that, there was kind of a new world emerging, right? And that there was going to be skills that their children would need that maybe they couldn't teach, right? That Indigenous people didn't really have. And so they wanted their kids educated so that they could be successful in this new world, right? And I point that out because I think probably all of our parents have done the same thing, have they not? They all sent us to school so we could learn skills that we would need to live in this kind of world that's emerging, right? It's the same thing for all of us, right? All of our parents have done exactly what Indigenous parents wanted, right? They wanted education for their kids. They also asked for some ammunition, right? For some bullets for guns because they didn't manufacture any themselves. Some clothing, and of course they wanted rights to hunt and fish where they wanted, right? Because they've been doing that for thousands of years. And so that's kind of what they were supposed to get. And in exchange, they would allow the Europeans, the white man, to kind of live in their lands and kind of do what they were already doing, right? That was kind of supposed to be the agreement. But it didn't really work out that way. So these treaties were negotiated. It turns out the Indigenous people were really good negotiators because the government agent would go to like one group of Indigenous people and sit down and negotiate an agreement with them. But someone from the next Indigenous group would come and like sit in the negotiations. And then when he found out what the final deal was, he'd go back home. And so when the government agent came there, they're like, okay, we know what you gave the other guys. That's where we're going to start. What more can you give us? So they're actually pretty good. They're pretty good negotiators. But unfortunately, the Canadian government wasn't really interested in negotiating in good faith. Okay, and so some of the things that they negotiated wound up not being in the official document. And it was difficult for Indigenous people to determine that because, of course, none of them could read, right? These are people who are non-literate. Not that they can't read, but their cultures just don't write anything down, right? And so they can't read the documents. And so they kind of have to trust that the Canadian government put everything in there that they agreed to, which, again, they didn't always do that. As time kind of went on, the negotiations went away, okay? Because the first groups to negotiate, or the first groups to sign treaties were in a bit of a better position, right? So they weren't totally out of food, they weren't totally desperate, and they were able to do that thing, right? They were able to say, okay, we know what you gave to the last group, what are you going to give us, right? And so they could really negotiate hard. But as time went on, food started to kind of run out, right? It became more and more difficult to survive on the land. And so the last people, the last groups that kind of held out to sign treaties, they wound up being really desperate. And so they kind of signed whatever the government put in front of them, right? And here I've got a little quote here which doesn't perfectly sum up what's going on, but yeah. So finally, it says the treaty was signed not after serious negotiations, nor with any spirit of compromise. Governor Laird had come to the session with the treaty in his pocket. So again, toward the end of this period, the government is just writing up the agreement and saying, here, sign it. If you want anything, sign this. And again, by this point, some Indigenous people were so desperate for support, they needed support, that they couldn't negotiate. They just had to sign it, right? Yeah, when they parted company, the commissioners had a document that said that the Blackfoot, who were an Indigenous group, had surrendered their lands. The chiefs, on the other hand, believed that they had been promised protection for the buffalo herds and treaty money for allowing the white man to come into their ancestral grounds. Yeah, so again, there's some kind of false promises here, right? But there's also a problem in terms of how they think of the land, right? Indigenous people don't feel that you can own the land. They don't think that's a thing you can do. Like, can you own the air? No. Indigenous people often think of themselves as part of the land, or they think of the land as kind of like their mother, right? The land takes care of you, it nurtures you, it teaches you. Can you own your mother? No, right? That's ridiculous. That's a strange thought, right? But it's a similarly strange thought for Indigenous people to think that land can be owned, right? To them, they're just like, it's just like owning your mother. They're like, what are you talking about? That's bizarre, right? But of course, for the Europeans, we know that land ownership is a very common thing, right? They're very used to owning land and selling it and buying it and inheriting it, and yeah, that's just how land is treated in Europe. And so they have kind of fundamental differences in what they think they're doing, right? Indigenous people are saying, okay, we give you permission to come into our ancestral lands. And the Europeans are saying, cool, we bought all this land, right? The very different understandings of what has happened, right? So they've signed one document, but they both have very different ideas about what they've just done, right? And so, yeah, but neither side really understood what they had given away, right? To Laird here, buffalo preservation and firewood compensation were minor considerations, not to be taken seriously, right? The things that the Indigenous people really wanted, the government agent didn't see that. He was like, oh, well, whatever, we'll see. Maybe we can do it, who knows, right? But for the chiefs, they didn't really understood that they had sold their land, right? They didn't really understand what that meant, right? And so, again, you have these people entering into an agreement, and the government is not negotiating in good faith, right? They're trying to take advantage of these people, but also the Indigenous people don't quite understand what they're doing, right? Because there's a big cultural difference, right? Treaties are supposed to be relationships, right? Ongoing relationships that get renegotiated as time goes on, right? Legal documents are different, right? Once you sign a legal document, that's it, right? It says what it says, and you are responsible for what it says in it. You don't get to renegotiate it later. Well, unless both sides agree, but still, it says what it says, right? So these two groups, the Canadian government and Indigenous people, really could not be further apart, right? In terms of their approach to negotiation, their approach to kind of contracts and relationships, their idea about what is land and what can you do with it and what can you not do with it. These two groups can't be further apart, right? And so they make an agreement in which nobody's really, the government's not really interested in following through on their side of it, and Indigenous people don't quite understand what the government is asking of them. Right? They don't quite get that they are giving up their legal title to the land, right? Because that concept just doesn't exist in Indigenous culture, right? The ownership of the land does not, it's not a thing, right? So, yeah, so shortly after that, the government passes this, the Indian Act, okay? The Indian Act is a piece of legislation, right? So it's kind of a law that's been passed. It's passed here in 1876, and it describes the relationship between Indigenous people and the government. Okay, so it's a law that has that basically defines that relationship. But Indigenous people have no role in negotiating this. Okay, so the government just passes it on their own. Okay, and in it. There's lots of things, and the Indian Act used to be kind of a disaster because it used to have lots of racist stuff in it, and it had lots of things that was meant to strip any power from Indigenous people in Canada. Okay, so this wasn't, like if you think of a Declaration of Human Rights, right, or a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, if you think of that kind of thing. The Indian Act is the opposite of that. Okay, it's like here's all the rights and privileges you don't have, and so it talks about it from everything from, who can be considered a First Nations person and who is not, who gets what benefits, who can leave the reserve and when can they not leave the reserve. When can the government move the reserve when they feel like it? When can they build a pipeline through the reserve if they feel they want to? The idea that Indigenous people can't practice some of their traditional ceremonies, that Indigenous people can't wear their traditional clothing, that Indigenous people can't hang around a pool hall. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff in there. And again, if you think of a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, this is the opposite of that. Okay, the Indian Act is the opposite of that. And again, it gave the government total power over Indigenous people, right? Over their governance, over their education, over the very question of who is an Indigenous person, right? Are you Indigenous? Well, it depends what the government thinks. If you are, then you have a little status card. You have status. If they don't think you are, then you don't have a status card. And if you don't have, what's that? What's the what? Status? Yeah, so based on those treaties and based on the Indian Act, the Canadian government does try to give some benefits to Indigenous people. They're not that great. But there are benefits coming to you, but in order to get them, the government has to identify you as an actual Indigenous person. And so once they do, they give you a little status card. And so people who are called status Indians. Other peoples are non-status. So the government doesn't see them as Indigenous, even though they might be. So, but of course that was determined by the government, right? Not by Indigenous people themselves. So there was lots of kind of racist stuff in here to begin with. A lot of it, oh yeah, and then there's this, right? So if you have any doubts about my stating what the Indian Act was, this is the guy who was in charge of the government ministry that was responsible for interacting with Indigenous people. I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department, and that is the whole objective of this bill. Right? So, again, if you have any misconceptions about what the government was trying to do, it's right here. Right? Basically, they want indigenous people to somehow go away, right? They didn't all die of smallpox and tuberculosis. They didn't all die of starvation once they shot all the buffalo. The government kind of moved them off into reserves, right, into little sections of land that belong to them. But the government is trying to sort of somehow make them go away, right? How can we make these people go away? And what they're talking about here is they're trying to assimilate them, right? Do you know what assimilate means? The strict definition of assimilate, when you assimilate things, you kind of make them the same. You take two things and you kind of make them into the same thing. And that's what they're trying to do here. They're trying to make indigenous people go away and just make them like any other Canadian. They're not what?
Are they known as an Indian? So do they call them an Indian?
Oh yeah. So that's the. I used to have a slide in here, and I should put it back in, but I don't. These people have been referred to by different names over the years, and yeah. So we started out, not we, but the first thing that these people were called were Indians because when Christopher Columbus arrived here in the New World in 1492, thought he was arriving in India, right? So he thought he was in India, and he's like, oh look, Indians, right? Not Indians. they're indigenous people. They have no relation to people from India, but the name kind of stuck, right? And so for a long time we kind of used it, but it picked up a bit of a racist kind of feeling about it. So we don't really use it anymore. But the problem is it's kind of a legal definition, right? Indian is kind of a legal word now. So like in regular speech, we wouldn't call anyone. I wouldn't call a First Nations person an Indian. That's not good anymore, right? But unfortunately, we are still left with this legal word. So to be, because the Indian Act is still in effect. It's still around, and I'll show it to you here if you want. Also, if you're interested, you can look up any law in Canada on the government website. They're all there, but I'll show you here, and then we'll take a break, I promise. Yeah, so here it is. This is the Indian Act. It is still in existence. Again, a lot of the really kind of like really bad racist stuff has been removed, right? Things about indigenous people not being able to leave their reserve without a permit. That's been taken out, right? They're free to practice their traditional ceremonies. That stuff's been taken out. But it's still kind of a problematic thing. But here you can see, this kind of defines the government's relationship with indigenous people, right? Reserves, possession of land, roads and bridges, descent of property and wills, mentally incompetent Indians, guardianship, loans, farms, treaty money, taxation, right? So all of this stuff is, it is still there, right? So again, the Indian Act is a piece of legislation that starts out in 1876, and again, it starts off as a tool to assimilate indigenous people, and since then it's kind of evolved a little bit, but it's still kind of a problem as well, right? Like this thing defines the relationship between indigenous people and the Canadian government, but it's also a bit of a problem, right? We said that one of the beliefs of race-based societies, remember from the thing we read, race-based societies believe that racial differences should be written into the legal codes of the country. That's what this is, right? This is a racial difference that has been written into the legal code. None of this, none of this stuff applies to me, right? None of it, because I'm not an indigenous person. This only applies to indigenous people, right? And so, again, there's a lot of controversy about the Indian Act. Some people want to get rid of it, right? Some people are saying, no, this is a racist piece of legislation. It needs to go. We need to get rid of it. But then some indigenous people say that, well, yeah, but this describes our relationship to the Canadian government. This describes what the Canadian government owes us. If it's gone, then there's no legal basis for that relationship, and we're just like anyone else. What's that? The Indian Act describes, again, how the government interacts with indigenous people, right? So sometimes there are rules, sometimes they are. Well, let's see here. What's a good example? Treaty money. Here you go. So money that is payable to Indians or Indian bands under a treaty between Her Majesty will be paid out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund. So that says where the money comes from. This says the governor in council may make regulations. So it explains what kind of tax laws can be made. What the punishment is if people don't pay their taxes. That's about it. This is elections of chiefs and band councils. So if a group of indigenous people are going to elect their chief or their council, these are the rules that they should follow. Blah, 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 blah. And so it's kind of a mix, Dunya. Some of them are rules and regulations. Some of them are, benefits that come to them. Some of them are just rules for how they should go about doing things like this. It's kind of a mix of things. But again, it doesn't have a great, the Indian Act doesn't have a great origin story, if you will. It doesn't come from a good place. And so it's kind of controversial now about how to feel about it. And again, some people are strongly against it and would like to get rid of it. Other indigenous people say, no, we need this because it's the only legal connection between us and the federal government. And if it's gone, then we're just like everyone else. And we don't want to be like everyone else, right? So they want to change it, right? They want to renegotiate it, but they don't want to just throw it out. But yeah, it still exists. This thing is still on the books. Okay, let's take a quick break, okay? Because we've gone a little longer than I meant to. Quick break, we'll come back, okay? Yes. Here we go. Okay, and we're back. So, as I was kind of explaining, things kind of continue to go downhill for indigenous people, right? When Europeans first came here, they had a reasonably equal relationship, or at least, or indigenous people really had the power in the relationship. As colonists continued to arrive, that those relationships evolved a little bit. Like in Eastern Canada, sometimes the British and the French fought against indigenous people. Sometimes indigenous people fought with the British to fight against the French. Sometimes indigenous people teamed up with both to fight against the Americans. So, sometimes they were enemies, sometimes they were allies. It was there was some sort of equality there, but again, as we get into kind of the 1800s, the amount of power that indigenous people have in Canada just sort of continues to decline, right? And here you can see by the end of the 1800s here, the government pretty clearly has a policy that they are going to make these people somehow go away, right? Because they just don't want to deal with them, right? They're inconvenient, right? They're an inconvenient thing that the government has to deal with, and the government just wishes they would go away so that Canada can be a white Christian European country, right? And you can pretty clearly, Duncan Campbell Scott, you can pretty clearly hear him say that, right? That's exactly what the government's trying to do. And so the government went about kind of trying to assimilate or destroy First Nations culture or First Nations ness as an identity in kind of a number of different ways, right? And so the Indian Act kind of took away their power to govern themselves. It took away their power to identify who was part of their community and who wasn't. It took away their ability to move around freely. It took away their ability to practice their ceremonies and rituals. It took away their ability to wear their own clothes. And of course, it also created Indian residential schools, which I think by this point probably most students in Canada have heard about. They're kind of a big deal. They became a much bigger deal. I guess it was it earlier this year? I guess it was earlier this year or late last year. Time is so hard to figure out with COVID, right? I don't know when anything happened anymore. But of course, with the discovery of 215 unmarked graves outside of an Indian residential school in Kamloops, this is kind of a big deal, right? And so I won't go too deeply into this kind of thing. You don't need to spend too much time thinking or reading about residential schools to kind of understand how awful this is, but I'll try to get it across. So this photo here, or this pair of photos, is probably a good summary of what Indian residential schools were trying to do. And so here's a young boy that arrived at an Indian residential school in Regina, Saskatchewan in 1874. And you can pretty clearly see what's happened to him, right? So on the right, there he is when he arrives, wearing his traditional clothing, and his hair is done in a traditional way. And then on the right, you see him, kind of dressed in a very European fashion, right? His hair's been cut. He's wearing these pants and a jacket kind of thing. And that was really the whole point, right? These two pictures sum up exactly what they were trying to do, right? They were trying to take these children as Indians, as First Nations people, and turn them into non-Indians, right? They were trying to assimilate them. Again, most of these schools were boarding schools, so the kids actually went to these schools and lived at them as well as studied at them. Many of these schools that they went to were hundreds of kilometers away from their home. That was on purpose. because the government didn't want these kids to be able to go back home regularly, right? They wanted to, we talked about in this class the process of socialization or enculturation, right? The passing on of culture from one generation to the next, right? The downloading of our operating system, right? We talked about that. Basically, what the government was trying to do was interrupt that, right? To stop the download, to erase the operating system that had been installed already, and to install a new operating system, right? White European OS, right? Not indigenous OS. That's basically what they were trying to do. But of course, it's a good analogy to talk about humans as computers, but humans are not computers, right? You can't simply uninstall and reinstall software just like that, right? And yeah, I don't know who said this. But it's often quoted that the job of these schools was to kill the Indian in the child, right? Which almost sounds like an exorcism, right? It almost sounds like some sort of a demon possession thing, which again is not strange to hear them use that language, because most of these schools were run by churches, right? Catholic Church, the Anglican Church. The government sort of paid for these Indian residential schools, but they were run by churches. Right? Again, as you probably large numbers of Indigenous kids went to these schools, and again, they were open for 100 years. Right, the first ones were opening in the late 1800s. The very last one closed in 1993, I believe. So thousands and thousands of kids went to these schools. At least 6,000 of these children died while in attendance. I am positive that number is wrong, and I am positive that that number is low, because the records for these schools were not well kept, right? Clearly they buried a lot of kids without even marking their graves. So a lot of kids died in the process of going to these schools. And again, the correct number of kids dying at school is 0, right? That is the correct number of students dying at school is 0, right? Even 1 is too many, right? And here we have at least 6,000 and unquestionably more. Well, they died because they were treated incredibly poorly, right? So any kind of expression of Indigenous culture, whether they used their traditional names, whether they spoke a word or two in their traditional language, anything they did that was perceived to be Indian was harshly punished. And so these kids were beaten, they were physically assaulted, emotionally abused, sexually assaulted. Some of them ran away and died in the wilderness. Some of them, many of them probably got diseases because everybody was kind of squished into this tiny school, and any illnesses they had weren't really treated. So tuberculosis probably killed quite a number, smallpox, measles, poor treatment, poor food, infections from injuries, from beatings, you name it, right? Lots and lots of, there's probably as many reasons for death as there are deaths. But all of them have to do with, the gross mistreatment of these kids by the people who ran these schools. And the government, who probably knew what was going on, but didn't much care. Right? I have another quote. It's not in my slides here, but again, it's Duncan Campbell Scott, and he says that we know that Indian children die at school at a greater rate than non-Indian children, but this alone does not justify a change in our policy. Yeah. So you've got kids dying at your schools, but that's not a reason to change your policy. What is then, right? Like what is there more serious than kids dying at your school, right? So yeah, like what happened here is just monstrous, right? Like, and I can't overstate how brutal this is, right? Especially given the fact that these are kids, right? These aren't adults; they are small children, right? Who were grossly mistreated, right? And again, you know, I assume not every student was abused, but the numbers are so high as to, you know, there's no use defending any of them. There's no use defending any of these schools, right? They were all instruments of assimilation, right? And they tried to assimilate people in the most brutal way possible, right? So, yeah, this is, yeah, it's kind of impossible to overstate how bad these places are. And again, kids were removed from their families, from their communities. They were sent to these schools. They were supposed to be getting an education, right? Their parents had asked the government to provide education for their kids. But even if you put all of the abuse aside, even if you put all of that sexual and emotional and physical abuse aside, the education they were getting was very, very poor, right? So none of these kids were going to go on and be doctors or lawyers, right? They were getting just enough education so that they could read and write and so that they could occupy the lowest jobs in Canada, right? They were just getting enough education so that they could do that, and that was enough, right? And so, again, even if you put all of the abuse aside, they were still getting a crappy education. And then there was all of this horrible stuff happening on top of it. And so, yeah, it's absolutely brutal, right? And again, it's not something you would think. It's not something you would think of when you think about Canada, right? You would think it would. You would think we're not the kind of country that would kind of do this, right? But as it turns out, it is. It's all too real, right? And Indigenous people have been living with this knowledge for decades, right? For decades and decades. And really only now is non-Indigenous Canada kind of sitting up and saying, oh, what happened here, right? And Indigenous people are like, yeah, we know what happened here, right? We know we've lived with this for a long time, right? And so, say a little louder. Now?
Yeah.
Well,
No, I mean like, because you said the old parents moved here.
yeah,
They took over the land.
yeah. Most of the people that came here, the French and the British are here first. The French are actually here just a little before the British, and so more in the early part of Canada's history, it's mostly French and British people coming over. A little bit later, like when Canada is starting to try to fill in that central part of Canada, they start to look to Eastern Europe. They try to bring British settlers into central Canada, but they come and then they all go home after a year because it's too cold, and they can't hack it. They can't make it, and so they go home. And so the Canadian government starts looking to Eastern Europe, like Ukraine, and places like that, because the Ukrainians are used to dealing with harsher climates. And so there's actually a lot of Ukrainians come over, and there's a lot of people with Ukrainian heritage living in kind of central Canada, like in Saskatchewan and Alberta, because their ancestors came over in the late 1800s to farm, and the Canadian government kind of encouraged them to do so. So most of the people in power were either British or French, but there were also some other technically white people, but kind of Eastern Europeans that were brought in to start farms and that. So, yeah, the Europeanness is mostly British and French, but other groups, other people from other places come over a little bit later. Yeah, and so, yeah, brutal stuff. Okay, that is, we've only got 5 minutes left. That's all I have for you today. Tomorrow, um, tomorrow we'll talk about the field trip. I'm going to give you the permission slips because I've got to print them off that you will need only if you're under 19. If you're over 19, you don't need guardian permission to go.
Sucks being underage.
Yeah, I know. Only a few more years there, Eunice. I'll get you that. We'll talk about the field trip. I'll talk about the final project too. I'm almost done writing it out. I just got to add a few more things. So I'll give that to you tomorrow and we can talk about it and you'll kind of have a better idea of what it is and we can start working on it. I'll give you class time to work on it as well, so we'll start moving forward on that, okay? But until then, that is all. I'll end it there. Have a nice afternoon. Actually, looks like it's going to be a pretty nice day, so that's cool. Have a nice afternoon, and I will see you tomorrow, okay? Okay.